Hey everyone, welcome to the March 15th edition of the TimeformUS Pacecast. I'm David Aragona. I'll be joined in just a moment by my co-host, Craig Milkowski. This week on the podcast, we're going to be taking a look at last weekend stakes racing from around the country, focusing on those two stakes-laden cards at Oaklawn Park and Santa Anita. At Oaklawn, they ran the Rebel Stakes last weekend, one of their preps for their local Arkansas Derby, their final prep for the Kentucky Derby, and Bob Baffert added to his arsenal of three-year-olds marching towards the Kentucky Derby. We'll talk about that race in depth, along with some of the other stakes action at Oaklawn Park on Saturday. We saw She Dares the Devil come back in the Azeri, Whitmore and CZ Rocket face off in the Hot Springs. We'll get to that in a little bit. Over at Santa Anita on the West Coast, we saw the much-anticipated return of Swiss Skydiver in the Beholder Mile. A triumphant return to the races for her, an exciting 2021 campaign on tap for that one. Also some stakes action and some impressive maiden winners that took place at Santa Anita last week, so we'll talk about that. Then we'll finish things up by talking about races at a couple of other venues. Gulfstream Park featured some allowance and maiden races for the three-year-olds that might be worth noting, and at Aqueduct, we had some fast races on both Saturday and Sunday at the allowance and maiden level. But Craig, the focus on Saturday really was at Oaklawn Park, where they ran that Rebel Stakes, 50 Derby qualifying points on the line for the winner, and Concert Tour took those home and looks like just another Derby contender for Bob Baffert.
Yeah, I'm waiting for people's top 10 list to almost have all Baffert horses on it. I can't keep track anymore. But yeah, just a really solid effort by Concert Tour. He proved that he could handle the two turns, at least up to a mile and a 16th. The one thing that struck me in this race was the riding tactics by Joel Rosario. I just thought he gave a phenomenal ride, taking it to his main rival, Caddo River and Florent Geroux. That one blinked a little bit, and basically at that point, the race was over. He got a nice 116 TimeformUS speed figure, so as good as an effort as it was visually, that probably only ranks him as maybe the third best Bob Baffert horse at this point. But it was only, I believe, his third lifetime start, so maybe there's some more room to improve.
Yeah, we've got probably 4 Bob Baffert horses that are on track to make the Derby at this point. Beyond Concert Tour, you obviously have Life is Good. I would imagine Medina Spirit is still on track. And even Spielberg, who's been picking up checks steadily along the way, he's probably going to accrue enough Derby qualifying points by the time they get to the first Saturday in May, so he could make it into the Derby as well. And there might be even some others to join that group, given some of the maiden and allowance performances that we've been seeing on the West Coast. We'll talk about some of those in a little bit. But as for Concert Tour in this Rebel, I agree with you. Joel Rosario gave him a perfect ride. Decisive move coming out of the gate. This horse broke very sharply, but Joel had a clear plan to get this horse to the lead. And Florent Geroux did help a little bit by relinquishing and deciding to try and rate Caddo River. That one seemed to resent those tactics a little bit. I don't think Caddo River, though, was ever going to be any match for Concert Tour. He just looked like he was traveling as the winner every step of the way. His ears pricked down the backstretch, and Joel just lightly asked him in the stretch, and he ran off to a pretty clear victory. I'm not sure how much I want to upgrade this performance over the speed figure of 116, which was solid enough. He did win somewhat geared down at the end, but his two main rivals, Caddo River and Keep Me in Mind, they both put in pretty disappointing performances. I guess maybe the change of running style didn't work for Caddo River. I don't know what the excuse was for Keep Me in Mind. He was just pretty dull every step of the way.
Yeah, we should mention, you were mentioning all the bad Bob Baffert horses. He ran 1-2 in here. Hosier ran second, so I'm sure he got a decent amount of points. I forget what the spread is, maybe 20 points or something for second. So I imagine they'll keep him on the trail. He's a pretty lately raced horse. And I thought Big Lake ran pretty well also. He ran third, got a 109 TimeformUS speed figure. And I think there's a really good argument he would have been second if not for getting body checked by Caddo River at the top of the stretch. He really seemed to knock him off stride and kind of cost him that position, I think.
And for you as a figure maker, I imagine this was a pretty easy day to get a handle on all these mile and 16th races because there were a few stakes run at this distance. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe the Revel featured the fastest pace of those 3 stakes races run at this distance. So while it looked like Concert Tour was doing it very easily on the front end, he did set a pretty honest pace in doing so.
Yeah, it was definitely a solid pace. That's why I saw a lot of talk about Florent Geroux and criticizing the ride for strangling him back. But honestly, the first quarter mile was a 134 pace figure. So, I don't know what you do in that situation. Do you go in and just give up any chance you really have, or do you just go on and hope you can outrun the other horse? I don't know the answer. Personally, Caddo River, if I was the owner, I just want them to go with it and see, but I'm not going to get too critical of jockeys because Concert Tour was flying. You could see it visually. Some people question the fractions, but just watching him go, I mean, Joel just gunned him out of there. He was rolling, so he had to make a split-second decision. And to be fair, Caddo River pretty much on his own went up and wanted to engage right away. And he was held back a little by Florent Geroux, but given how things turned out in the stretch, I don't really think it made any difference. He was just much the best horse. I do want to bring up just briefly the San Vicente, the Concert Tour one was one of those races. We have a T where they were really struggling timing races at Santa Anita. And I think this is one that vindicates that those fractions were just totally bogus. I mean, I knew it. I didn't need vindication, but maybe some other people who had questions will see it now.
Speaking of those two jockeys, Florent Geroux and Joel Rosario, we saw the roles reversed a little earlier on the card at Oaklawn Park in the Grade 2 Wazeri as Florent Geroux on the outside, but She Dares the Devil outbroke Joel on Latruska, who was expected to be the early lead, and Florent sent She Dares the Devil to the front. She secured that early position from Latruska, who was in second, and Latruska's a horse who typically needs the lead to be successful, but she was able to stalk here, got up to She Dares the Devil on her flank on the outside in the stretch, and these two put on a real show to the wire. An exciting race to watch.
Yeah, this was a virtual match race, and She Dares the Devil she won the race at the start. I think she was able to outbreak Latruska. I think you made a very good observation on the forecast with Latruska that the blinkers have really made her a different horse. And even though she didn't win today, I actually am more optimistic about her going forward because she showed she can kind of rate a little bit, and she's not the crazy runoff who, before she took those blinkers off, actually, when she wore blinkers, she was just running off, setting crazy fractions all in red and just hoping to hang on. So even though she went down in defeat in this case, I liked her effort. I think they both ran very well. She Dares the Devil got a 121 TimeformUS speed figure for the win. Latruska, a 120. So I just thought it was really good effort from both of the top two.
Yeah, I thought this was a really nice return for She Dares the Devil, who was making her first start as a 4-year-old. No surprise that she got a speed figure in the low 120s. She had done that twice at the end of her 3-year-old season, so you would imagine she could only go forward from here. And Latruska, she's just pretty consistent. She usually gets those figs in the high 1-teens, can get into the low 120s at times. And yeah, I completely agree with your take and what we were talking about in the forecast last week. She just seems like she doesn't need the lead anymore now that they took the blinkers off. And she ran a really nice race here. I think that she was favored slightly over She Dares the Devil because there was probably a little more trust placed in her recency by the bettors. But Latruska and She Dares the Devil, they seem like fillies with, or I should say filly and a mare with very similar ability. And I'm not sure that they're both going on to the Apple Blossom. I saw a headline that maybe they might be headed in different directions with the powerful Swiss Skydiver likely headed there. Maybe they'd want to duck her. One of them would. But these two seem like big players in the filly and mare division moving forward.
Yeah, that's going to be, it seems like at this point, don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves in horse racing, but the Apple Blossom could be shaping up to be the race of the year early in the season.
Little later in that Saturday card at Oaklawn Park, they ran the 6-furlong Hot Springs, which was a rematch of last year's Breeders' Cup Sprint, as that race's winner, Whitmore, was taking on the second-place finisher, CZ Rocket, and a reversal of that finishing position here as CZ Rocket just got up to deny Whitmore 5 straight wins in the Hot Springs. Really no excuse for Whitmore. He got the trip that he needed. Seemed maybe just a little bit rusty off the layoff.
Yeah, he was hadn't raced since the Breeders' Cup, and neither had CZ Rocket for that matter, but Whitmore is an 8-year-old at this point, so maybe he needed one, but this was just a good, solid race. CZ Rocket got a 119, so, they're not exactly grade 1 sprinters, at least in the traditional sense. Who knows with what we have out there right now? We've seen some pretty good performances early in the season, but these two are the top of the division based on running 1-2 in the Breeders' Cup until somebody can knock them off. Somehow Flagstaff, my favorite horse, got bet more than CZ Rocket, which is just amazing to me. I don't get it with this horse, but I'm not going to complain. I didn't get this one right. It didn't help me in this case, but Just a decent effort. I'm not going to get overwhelmed by this race and pretend it was something it wasn't. I mean, a 119 speed figure for older mares sprinting just isn't that good, but that's the state of the division right now.
Yeah, I mean, I have no real argument with what you said. CZ Rocket was just the best horse in this race. He didn't even break that well, was a little farther back than I think you might have expected on the backstretch, made a big wide run into the race on the far turn, and just simply ran down Whitmore. The fact that they're not breaking a 120 TimeformUS speed figure it's not that big of a deal this early in the year, because this race is probably just a prep for some other races down the line with grades attached to them. But we have seen some faster sprinters out there, both in New York and California, with Brickyard Ride and Chateau winning the toboggan, or the Tom Fool, I should say, last week or a couple weeks ago. So definitely it's going to be an interesting sprint division once these horses step up in class to contest those grade 1 and grade 2 races, to see how they sort themselves out and if those horses exiting last year's Breeders' Cup Sprint still turn out to be the top of the division this year. The other stakes race to discuss from last Saturday at Oaklawn Park was the Essex, going that same mile and a 16th distance, where they also contested the Rebel and the Azeri. This one for the older horses and colts was won by Silver State for Steve Asmussen. He was achieving his 4th consecutive victory since returning late last year. He's now a 4-year-old. This is a horse who I thought had some distance limitations. He certainly got the mile and the 16th distance here. Didn't do it in the most impressive fashion because he was just holding off Rated R Superstar, who I don't think anybody's going to mistake for one of the top handicap horses in the country. But Silver State has kind of turned into a win machine. He just knows how to get it done.
Yeah, he's being spotted well by Steve Asmussen, to be fair. I mean, he's picking up big purse. I mean, it's a $500,000 purse for a race without a grade. So it was a good spot for him. But, I mean, as far as the speed figure goes, it's nothing overwhelming whatsoever. He got a 117 for the win. So, I mean, grade 3 at best type number. I'm not sure who will show up on Arkansas Derby Day for that what is it? Oaklawn Handicap. But I would imagine that there will be a lot better field than what we saw here.
Yeah, I would imagine the same. The 117 is just, it's not really a top number for horses that are going to have a say in the graded stakes races in this division later. So we'll see if some tougher horses show up for that Oaklawn Handicap. One more race to discuss from Oaklawn Park last week. That was an allowance race that was run on Thursday, going 6 furlongs. This one was won by the old classy horse Strike Power, who's now in the Steve Asmussen barn. He was getting some class relief that he probably needed, beaten in his prior start in a stakes race. I believe that was the King Cotton that he was coming out of. In against allowance foes here, he contested the pace throughout and just kicked away in the stretch to a nice-looking victory.
Yeah, it was a good effort from him. He's only going to show with a 116 TimeformUS speed figure, but the final time was a 121. But that said, it is knocked down 5 points because even though he was up there dueling with a horse who's probably not as good as him, as we saw in Hollis, they were going pretty darn slow. The early pace figure was less than a 110, the half mile only a 111, and those two flew home to just clear the field. I mean, they didn't really pull away, but they were never threatened. They were 1-2 all the way around. So, again, they're only a couple points off of what we saw from CZ Rocket, so I'm not going to be too critical, but it's just not that great of a race. I mean, it's good to see him get back in the winning track. It had been a few races since he's actually been to the winner's circle. He was a promising sprinter as a 3-year-old and has kind of disappointed since, but I'm not sure what to make of him at this point.
Yeah, Strike Power has always been sort of a frustrating horse. He even was when he was with Mark Hennig, who had him originally. A horse that can pop these big figures every so often, but often struggles in the tougher races when the chips are down, when he has more pace to compete with on the front end. So I'm not that optimistic that even though this number was just 3 points lower than the Hot Springs, that he would have been in the mix in a race like that. I think these lower class races are probably where he's going to shine in the future. Moving out to the West Coast over to Santa Anita, the feature race there on Saturday was the Beholder Mile for the older fillies and mares Grade 1 event. Going 1 mile, this race featured the return of last year's 3-year-old filly champion Swiss Skydiver, also the winner of last year's Preakness Stakes, beating Horse of the Year Authentic that day. Wasn't facing any Horse of the Year in this spot, and she did what she was supposed to do coming off the layoff, traveled like a winner throughout, got a perfect trip from Robbie Alvarado, and was just superior to this field.
Yeah, she was, and on paper, this wasn't a weak field. So, I mean, I was pretty impressed by the effort. We're doing the show early, so I don't have an official speed figure, but I would guess it's going to be around a 123, which is the fastest we're going to see all weekend anywhere. And now, on top of the figure, I was impressed with how she ran. She's a horse who most of her best races have been right up on the lead or just off of it. Not that she came from way back. I mean, she was just fourth early, a couple lengths behind, but she was kind of pinned in, took some dirt in her face, and just showed she has, you can maneuver her pretty easy. And once she got clear, she just basically blew the field away. A decent effort in behind for as time goes by, but I mean, she was going up against just a really good horse here. So Swiss Skydiver was the goods for me, and she'll be a serious factor in the Apple Blossom.
Yeah, I just can't wait to see what they decide to do with her this year. They were not afraid to ship last year around many different venues across the country. They'll obviously be shipping for the next race at Oaklawn. They talked about trying a race at Del Mar this summer. I would imagine a filly of her stature might also want to try the Grade 1 Ogden Phipps, which is one of the premier events of the summer in New York. So we'll see what they decide to do with her, but there are so many options, and just great to see her come back as a 4-year-old, maintaining and potentially even bettering upon that form that we saw from her as a 3-year-old. You always like to see that with these fillies, because you talked about it last week when we did the forecast. It's not always a guarantee that these fillies come back as the same horse after a winter season off when they return in the spring. Sometimes some of them go sour, but she seems like she's got that same competitive fire that she possessed last year, so that's just great to see. And I agree with you about as time goes by, who was second in here. A solid effort. I'd potentially even be a little more complimentary of her because Swiss Skydiver was so impressive in victory, and as time goes by was the only one that was really finishing on behind her. This is not a race where too many did much closing from the back of the pack, and I get the sense watching as time goes by that she might want to go even farther than this. A mile is what she's done in her last 2 starts, but the way that she finishes so strongly, I think she'll maybe appreciate a mile and a 16th, maybe even a mile and an 8th down the line. So Bob Baffert definitely has options with that lightly raced filly.
Yeah, I wasn't knocking her at all. If it made it seem that way, I thought she ran just fine. She just ran into a horse that's potentially a champion again this year. So good effort from her, especially if she can get away from Swiss Skydiver. And I'd agree with you. Distance is only going to help her. Unfortunately, you don't get a whole lot of shots of that in the filly and mare division, but maybe she can find some spots at a mile and an 8th that I think will be right up her alley.
The race right before the Beholder Mile was the Grade 3 San Simeon, going 6 furlongs on the turf at Santa Anita, and this one was won by Gregorian Chant, who's really found his niche as a turf sprinter. He's now 2 for 2 since they turned him back in distance to sprint this 6 furlong distance, and it seems like Phil D'Amato has really figured this horse out. This was not the toughest turf sprint that we're going to see in this division, but he put forth another nice effort.
Yeah, he did. It's hard to knock. I didn't like him on the forecast because I had said he had a perfect setup last time. Still only ran a 114 TimeformUS speed figure to win, but it turned out that's about all you needed this time too. There were plenty of these turf sprints at Santa Anita. I timed them all from video, so I think the figure, I'm guessing it's going to be about 114. I'll have the official later today and we'll tweet those, but it is what it is. It wasn't a very strong race. I guess that's where he wants to go. I'm not going to knock the trainer for running him in sprints, but in my opinion, he just found a couple of spots where most of the competition didn't run and he was able to pick up the pieces.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. There were some disappointments in this race, topped by the even money favorite Jolie Olympica, the mare facing the males here. Just seems like she hasn't come back as quite the same horse off her last layoff, and this was a disappointing effort because she didn't even need to bring her A game to beat this field, and she just wasn't able to produce it. And some others like Sistron, who went off at nearly 7-1 in this race, took absolutely no money. I think that was a bad sign for a horse like that. He didn't run, and Bob and Jackie didn't handle the turn back at all. So the fact that those horses didn't really show up, it made it a much easier race for Gregorian Chant, and we'll see if he can handle some tougher sprinting fields in the future. We saw the fillies compete in that same distance on Sunday, California-bred fillies, that is, as Legs Galore kept her undefeated record on the turf intact. She's now 5 for 5 since switching over to that surface, and speed is the name of the game for her. She just runs them off their feet right from the start.
Yeah, that was for Cowbreds. That was a pretty impressive performance from her. Similar to the Saturday races, obviously, I'm not going to have the Sunday race figures, but I would guess that's going to be around a 117 Timeform US speed figure, which would have beat the Colts and the older horses that we just talked about. Now, you never know how that's going to play out when they actually show up because she was all alone on the front. Not sure that would have happened with a horse like Jolie Olympic in there, but no doubt about it. She can fly. I mean, when you open up 4 lengths going 6 furlongs, you're doing some running. So good effort from her, and I'll be interested to see what they do with her because she sure looks like she can handle open company.
Yeah, I agree with that. Her last two performances since returning as a 4-year-old from a layoff last year have just been spectacular. Maybe she just loves this 6 furlong configuration at Santa Anita because that's what she's done in her last two starts. But she's been very impressive these last couple of times, certainly superior to these California bred foes. So I agree with you. I would not be surprised to see her competitive against some open company in the future. Moving on to some of those non-stakes events they ran at Santa Anita last week. First, we'll stay on the turf with a race from Saturday. This was another 6 furlong allowance event won by Colthard for Phil D'Amato. This horse is now 2 for 2 since coming to the U.S. and seems like a promising sort, even though he just beat 3 rivals here.
Yeah, what impressed me was the time of his race and the speed figure he got. He's going to get around a 113, but what stood out to me was this race was only about a fifth of a second slower than the older horses ran in the stakes race. He's going to get, I guess it would be around a 113 Timeform US speed figure if we assume Gregorian Chance going to get a 114. So for a 3-year-old this time of year, I mean, he just looks really good. I'm not sure what his distance breeding says, but with his running style, to me, it seems like there's no reason he couldn't stretch out to 7 furlongs or even a mile. Obviously, that 7 furlong option's only available a couple of places, but he took a big step forward here, and this is a promising colt.
Yeah, he is promising. We'll see what happens when he faces the tougher field because the 3 rivals that he was meeting here are just probably not quite on his level, and he was superior to them. He also got the widest trip in this 4-horse field, so that's never ideal on the turf, but he's going to have to face some tougher tests in the future, though I agree that the time indicates that he's going to be up to the challenge of facing stakes company at some point. We'll finish things up at Santa Anita with a couple of maiden races won by horses making their career debuts, both of these 3-year-olds, beginning with a race from Saturday. This one was won by the Bob Baffert first-time starter Triple Tap, who was highly touted. Another small field, not the most competitive race from top to bottom, but Triple Tap does seem like a horse with a real future, and we should mention his pedigree. He's by Tappet, and he's out of the dam that produced American Pharaoh, making him a half-brother to that Triple Crown winner, also a full brother to Grade 1 winner Chasing Yesterday. So there's definitely potential for this horse to turn out to be a star still.
Yeah, no doubt about it. It's a little troubling. He got a pretty late start. I don't think he's a horse we're going to see on the Triple Crown Trail or anything like that. But Bob Baffert's brought horses along later on. We've seen that a few times, and they do just fine. So he could be one worth watching. I will note, it looks to me like it's going to be a pretty tough speed figure to make. It was a race. It was run early on the card. It was run between turf races. And the track just seemed a lot slower than it did for the other races. So I'm going to wait and see what my assistant does. If he breaks it out and treats that race in isolation like I would probably do, it would be maybe a 107 speed figure. If he doesn't, it would be, if he rates it with the other races, it would probably be in the mid 90s. And that just doesn't make sense to me, given how the horses who had run before in this race ran and how they'd run in the past. So I would guess it's going to be a 107, but it is a little bit iffy for me.
Yeah, even though it was a small field, Triple Tap was beating a couple of horses in Barraza and Eyes Open who had previously earned TimeformUS speed figures in the high 90s. So, I mean, it makes sense that it would be a number in the low to mid 100s. And Triple Tap, I think that this race might have gone a little slower due to the slow early pace. Obviously, I haven't seen pace figures for this race, but they went in the high 46s to the half mile. And for a final time at 123 at Santa Anita, that just seems like a pretty slow pace for the distance. And visually, it seemed that way as well, as this horse was under a long hold in the early going of this race. And Flavien Prat never really asked him for his best in the stretch. He just briefly shook the reins at him and he went away. And the part of this race that I actually liked the most was the gallop out, because he let this horse continue to run past the wire and he opened up a good dozen lengths on the rest of the horses. So seems like one that might want to go longer. The pedigree certainly confirms that. So this is one that I'd be excited about. And I know some of these Bob Baffert horses get really hyped before their debuts. We talked about Bezos a few weeks ago, who turned out to be a bust. But Triple Tap, to my eye, was working just as good, if not better than that horse. I mean, he was right on terms with Medina Spirit in his final work before the San Felipe. So he showed real promise in the morning. So this was hardly a surprise that he looked this good in the afternoon.
No, and what I was impressed with most was just how professional he looked. He took the rating really easily, just sat right off that leader and never looked like he wasn't going to go by. And he did so pretty easily. So he didn't look like a first-time starter on the track to me. And I would imagine he's going to progress pretty quickly.
Arguably even more visually impressive than Triple Tap on Saturday was the debut of the 3-year-old filly Missy P on Friday's card at Santa Anita. This was just going 5.5 furlongs, but this filly clearly has a ton of speed and a ton of class, as she was really never asked for anything and went clear to win this race by almost 10 lengths under no urging at the very end.
Yeah, this was a big effort, and this one is an official speed figure. She's going to get a 109 from us. I love the way she drew away. The pace wasn't particularly fast. Our half miles coded in blue. But I've mentioned before, I actually like seeing this from maidens because it tells me they can rate. They can probably get some more distance, particularly at this 5.5 furlong. That's not really a surprise. But there's just nothing but raves for me from this. This looked like a really talented filly.
Yeah, I completely agree. That final 16th of a mile, when she actually picked up the pace and went below 6 seconds for that final fraction, was just super impressive. And I mean, the margin of victory confirms that, as she easily went away from the field under no urging doing it. We should mention that she is a daughter of Into Mischief, as so many of these promising first-time starters seem to be, but she's also a full sister to Mia Mischief, who was a multiple Grade 1 winner, I believe, for Steve Asmussen. So there's definitely pedigree for this one to be a talented sprinter. We'll see how far she ultimately wants to go. The fact that they debuted her going 5.5 furlongs probably suggests that they are going to keep her short for now, but definitely a ton of speed and a ton of talent with this horse. Moving on to the two other venues we'll discuss on this show, beginning with Gulfstream Park, a race that caught the attention of many who will be fixated on the Kentucky Derby Trail. Was a Thursday allowance race won by Prevalence. This is a horse that turned a lot of heads in his career debut at Gulfstream Park a little over a month ago when he won at 7 furlongs. Came back going the one-turn mile here, and he got it done. He did it fairly easily, but he was the 1-10 favorite, beating horses that were clearly not in the same league as him. So I'm still not sure what I want to make of this horse moving forward.
No, I mean, he ran a 105 TimeformUS speed figure. He ran a 102 in his debut. So when horses have blowout wins like this, I mentioned with Caddo River, I mean, I know the temptation is for people to say they could have went faster. But the truth of it is most horses that get fast figures do so winning easily. So when horses like this are winning, but they're not really running all that fast, and of course that's relative. We're talking about, moving into graded stakes competition. For me, he's just not for me. He'd have to show me a lot more. I mean, it's not like he was running away from Southern Passage at the end of this race, I didn't think. That one made him work a little bit. Not that he was ever going to beat him or anything, but for me, I wasn't that impressed.
Yeah, and I would also note that while his debut looked so impressive when he won by 8.5 lengths under very little urging, from a visual standpoint, it looked like this horse might be a star. That race did not come back as fast as some might have assumed. You said the speed figure was just a 102. And when you look through the also-rans from that race, some of them have come back and run a little bit faster, but I think that's just the natural improvement that you'd expect to see. A few actually lost at short prices coming out of that race. Just hasn't proven to be, I think, the stronger race than the speed figure would have indicated that a lot of people were expecting it to be. And while Prevalence did win this race and was much the best, he was under urging to achieve that final time and run that 105 speed figure. So to my eye, it didn't look like he could have run a whole lot faster. And I don't know. I guess they'll try a Derby prep next because that just seems like the logical progression for a talented 3-year-old this time of year. But to me, there are just other horses out there that I want more than him.
Yeah, and I will mention I time all the mile races from video like Gulfstream because that's a really short run up, and Trackus really struggles with those. And this race wasn't as fast as it came up on the clock. I don't remember the exact amount. I think I tweeted it out, but maybe 0.3 of a second too slower at every call.
Staying at Gulfstream Park, there was a pretty quick starter allowance race that was run on Friday, won by Well Defined. You might remember was actually on the Derby Trail a couple of years ago. He was the 2019 Sam F. Davis winner. Obviously went off form over the past couple of seasons, dipped into some claiming races for a while, but moving back into starter allowance company here, he ran a pretty fast final time to get the job done, running just the tick over 121, going 7 furlongs. But I think that the race dynamics had a lot to do with that.
Yeah, it was a race where he wound up with us getting a 1:15 TimeformUS speed figure. So, solid effort. I'm not sure exactly where he's going to go from there with that one. I had totally forgotten that he was a horse who had won the Sam Davis, to be honest with you. I knew the name rung a bell, and he had kind of dropped off the radar. But as you mentioned, the pace was really slow. The early quarter mile and half mile were both 107 speed figures. He did fly home to get a 121 final time speed figure, but I think that 115 is a pretty good representation of his ability.
Yeah, when I'm looking up races for this podcast, sometimes what you see in the chart turns out to be a little incongruous with what you actually see on the replay when you go back to watch these races. And in the chart, it looked like this horse ran really fast every step of the way and was an impressive winner. But when you go back and watch the race, he was on his wrong lead for the entire stretch drive. The runner-up actually probably ran better closing into a slow pace. Just wasn't the most visually impressive performance. So while the time was fast, Gulfstream was playing pretty quick last week. And I wouldn't upgrade him too much off this performance. I don't think he's going to be coming back into stakes company anytime soon. Another race to talk about from last week at Gulfstream Park was a maiden race from Saturday. This one going 7 furlongs for the 3-year-olds, and it was won by Bears Watching for Shug McGahee. This is actually a half-brother to the Travers winner, Code of Honor. While Code of Honor was by Noble Mission. Sorry, forgot that for a sec. This horse is by a different turf sire, Caraconti, and he got the job done very impressively, but let's be honest, this race, and you could say the same about a lot of maiden races that have been run at Gulfstream Park lately, not the same quality that we're used to seeing in years past. So just a lot of horses that probably weren't in the same league as him.
Yeah, I mean, he was 3 to 5 for a reason. If you were waiting for me with help on Noble Mission, you'd have been waiting a while. That's just something I never remember, things like that. But Bears Watching got 100 TimeformUS speed figure, so solid enough. I have no idea what the plans are with him. Maybe grass, because he'd have a long way to go to be competitive in 3-year-old stakes. So don't be fooled by the margin. As you said, the field coming in was highly suspect. The main rival on paper looked like Stainless Steel, a second-time starter who had run okay, but he had a bit of a rough trip and was never in the race. And after that, it was just kind of a cakewalk.
Yeah, and I touched on it briefly. I think it's something that we've been seeing all winter at Gulfstream Park, and I was wondering if you have a take on it. You're getting a lot of these open lengths maiden winners at Gulfstream that seem like they would be achieving higher speed figures than they actually are, and I think a lot of it's just due to the competition. And some of the top barns that typically would be keeping horses at Gulfstream, they're competing at other venues. We've had some stronger maiden races at Aqueduct. You have some owners that are competing more out west this year, some different trainers getting horses, and it just seems like the overall quality of Gulfstream has been a little bit lower this winter.
Well, I mean, I think the first place you have to look is the purses. I mean, if I'm an owner, I don't want to break my maiden at Gulfstream because the purses are significantly lower than some of those other places that you talk about, namely Oaklawn, even Aqueduct. You can ship over to Tampa and probably find even easier spots. Now, their purses aren't as good as Gulfstream's, of course, but then the competition drops even a couple more levels. So I don't know 100% if that's what it is, but I would think, like I said, if I'm an owner or training horses, I want to break my maiden somewhere else when I can run for, 75% more money than what you're running for there.
Yeah, it's a good point. It just makes a whole lot of sense why we're seeing some stronger maiden races elsewhere. Speaking of maiden races, we're going to talk about one of those from Aqueduct last week. Though this race is not for 3-year-olds. It was for 3 and up fillies and mares, and it was actually won by a 4-year-old. This was an early race on Saturday's card that was won by the Bill Mott-trained filly Aunt Cat, a horse who had gone longer distances in her first 2 starts, once going a mile and last time going a mile and an eighth, but looks like she actually wants to sprint because the turn back did the trick for her as she won off easily by many lengths with a pretty fast speed figure.
Yeah, it was a good effort. I'll leave it to you. I didn't get to see it personally. We were kind of watching Aqueduct while I was at Oaklawn, but I didn't pay that much attention. So you could tell me about the track. We don't have it coded in red or anything, but she got a 1:13 TimeformUS speed figure, and the final time was a 1:18. It is another one of those cases where she set a pretty easy lead, easy pace, below 1:10 to the half mile, but she did get challenged a little bit, kind of shook off that challenger who, horse Strafe, who I think was actually one of the co-favorites or maybe a very close second choice in the race. I forget which it was, but she made a mockery of the field. Now, as I said, I didn't pay a lot of attention. You can fill me in on how the track was, if there was a speed bias or anything like that on Saturday, but certainly looked good visually and the number backed it up.
Yeah, unfortunately, it seems like the rail bias that we had been rid of on Gotham Week has returned at Aqueduct, and this filly's speed figure was definitely helped by the fact that she rode the rail the entire way. Of the 3 racing days this past week at Aqueduct, it seemed like the bias was strongest on Saturday when she ran, though still in evidence on Sunday. We'll talk about a race from Sunday in just a little bit. But even riding the bias every step of the way, this was an explosive performance for Aunt Cat, who got a 1:18 final time figure here. The early pace was on the slow side, and that helped as well. But it just seems like this is a horse that probably wanted to sprint all along, being by Uncle Mo. She's actually out of a dam who was a graded stakes winning sprinter. So I think just turning back really did the trick for her, and it'll be interesting to see where she really falls when she gets on a fair racetrack next time. The other race that I wanted to talk about from last weekend at Aqueduct was Sunday's 5th race, won by Mystic Knight. This was an allowance race going a mile and an eighth. I think it was the only 2-turn race on the card. And just from a speed figure standpoint, Craig and I were talking about this a little bit before recording. Sunday at Aqueduct was just a day that seemed to me impossible to make figures because the track appeared to be changing from race to race. There were some very high winds in the New York area that were causing some conditions that might have been difficult for the horses to deal with, and Aqueduct can be difficult for speed figure makers anyway, so it was just a recipe for some wacky times in certain races. But regardless of all that, the track was still playing to horses that had the rail position, giving them an advantage, and the winner of this 5th race, Mystic Knight, who was just coming out of a maiden victory last time out, he was never on the rail. He was about 2 to 3 wide for his entire race and ran down the loose on the lead second place finisher, Yankee Division, who got that rail trip. Just a really impressive performance for a 4-year-old who might be heading in the right direction.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, the speed figures were really tricky. We've talked about Aqueduct, how tough it can be before, and when you throw wind into it, it just makes it threefold, I guess, what it normally is. But in this case, it was almost a blessing that this was the only route. It made it kind of easy to make the speed figure. I would guess, I did it this morning, so I don't have the official one in front of me, but I think it's going to be about in the 114, 115 range. He did it without benefit of the track bias, as you say, and this is a horse who has progressed every time out. He had improved his speed figure 7 points second time out, then 13 points third time out, and another 13 this time. So he's certainly moving in the right direction, despite being by into mischief, which sometimes we get distance questions with him. He handled the mile and eighth just fine. So it seems like for him, the more distance, the better.
Yeah, and just taking a visual look at this horse, he seems like a real big, strong son of into mischief that would want every bit of ground he can get. Chad Brown tried him going 1 turn earlier in his career, even in some shorter races sprinting, and just seemed like he didn't really want any part of that. He got the mile when he broke his maiden prior to this, and the mile and an eighth just seemed to hit him right between the eyes this time. He was just relentless, closing from off the pace on a day when we didn't really see any other horses making up ground that powerfully on the outside. So credit to him for winning with that kind of trip, and I don't think at a distance is going to be any problem for him. Not that he's going to have to go much farther than 1.125 in the future, because while he is buy-in to Mischief, his dam is the half-sister to Share to Count, who was the winner of the Breeders' Cup Filly and Mare Turf, going 1 3/8 a number of years ago. So big stamina pedigree on the bottom side for this guy. So a lightly raced 4-year-old that I think might be worth watching. Well, that's all the racing to recap on the Pacecast this week. Remember that you can always listen to us on DRF.com, Spotify, iTunes, YouTube, and SoundCloud. Wherever you get your podcast, just make sure to subscribe to the Daily Racing Form channel. Thanks for listening this week, and make sure to stay tuned for that TimeformUS forecast coming up on Friday.